It pushed through the heat like an armoured razor, its flat steel plates slicing across dusty streets that were already vibrating with tension. Crowds scattered as this polygon-shaped brute appeared, more angular than anything a 1940s battlefield had any right to field, yet built from the simplest truck bones anyone could scrounge together. Every edge looked deliberate, every bolt a stubborn refusal to surrender breathing room, and still it carried its crew through chaos with a steadiness that defied its improvised origins. It didn't just look ahead of its time, it looked like the Cybertruck's great-grandfather turned up 50 years early. This was the Overvalwagen. The Overvalwagen was born from a crisis that arrived faster than anyone in the Netherlands. East Indies could reorganize their supply lines. Throughout the late 1930s, the colonies faced a strategic nightmare: enormous distances to patrol, rising political unrest, and a shortage of dedicated armoured vehicles precisely when the rest of the world was accelerating into mechanized war. Dutch planners had files full of tidy recommendations, but factories were an ocean away, budgets were strained, and procurement moved at a pace better suited to an age of clipper ships rather than the looming shock of the Pacific conflict. Local commanders saw the gap widening by the month. Infantry units were trying to police vast urban and rural areas using soft-skinned trucks that offered about as much protection as a garden shed. Meanwhile, every intelligence briefing pointed toward escalating tension. More demonstrations, more sabotage attempts, and increasingly organized groups testing the edges of Dutch authority. Patrols needed something tougher, something that could carry men safely through narrow streets, withstand thrown projectiles, and shrug off small arms fire without collapsing into a wreck. Technically, the requirements were surprisingly specific. The vehicle had to be built locally because shipping dedicated armour overseas was unrealistic. It needed enough power to move squads through dense city blocks without stalling under the weight of improvised plating. It had to resist fire from common rifles of the region, meaning its armour thickness couldn't be guessed. It had to be calculated properly to survive point-blank shots, and it had to fit cramped colonial streets without getting wedged like a misplaced delivery lorry. These demands forced Dutch engineers and colonial workshops to rethink their approach. They couldn't rely on factory-perfect European armoured cars, so they pivoted towards something rugged, angular, and brutally simple. An armoured body slapped onto sturdy commercial truck chassis already common across the Indies. The result would become instantly recognizable: slabs of steel arranged in bold geometric planes that looked more like an industrial prototype than a polished military product. In an era of elegant curves and riveted refinement, the Overvalwagen's shape landed like a metal hammer across the traditional design rulebook. It was the sort of machine that looked as if its designers had asked for subtlety and been told that the workshop was completely out of it. And yet, that blunt practicality was precisely what the situation demanded. The thinking behind the Overvalwagen was shaped not by doctrine from The Hague, but by the far more immediate pressures of life in the archipelago. Colonial commanders needed an armoured vehicle that could respond quickly to disturbances, navigate dense streets, and protect personnel without relying on European supply chains that were already stretched thin. The vision that emerged wasn't about battlefield dominance, but urban control, patrol endurance, and the ability to plant authority in places where ordinary trucks were simply too vulnerable. Engineers and officers approached the problem with the pragmatic mindset of people who had no luxury of perfection. Instead of waiting for shipments of European armoured cars, which might arrive months too late or not at all, they decided to build their own using whatever reliable chassis were already common across Java and Sumatra. Chevrolet and Ford truck frames offered a practical foundation, durable, familiar to mechanics, and supported by existing spare parts that could be sourced from local workshops. This meant the Overvalwagen could be repaired in the field rather than becoming a stranded hulk whenever a bolt sheared or a bearing gave out. The armour concept was equally grounded in practicality. Flat steel plates could be cut quickly, welded or bolted with minimal curvature, and reinforced without requiring advanced press-forming equipment. That simplicity is precisely why the vehicle developed such a stark geometric appearance: straight lines, hard edges, and almost architectural planes that looked as though they'd been drafted with a ruler rather than sculpted with finesse. The angles weren't decorative, but intentional, positioned to deflect small arms fire while keeping the total weight within what a civilian truck engine could tolerate without overheating. Internally, the vehicle had to carry a squad in relative safety while still allowing them to dismount rapidly. This demanded a compromise between interior volume and armour weight, leading to the tall-sided profile that gave the Overvalwagen its unmistakable silhouette. The designers accepted that it would never be elegant or comfortable. What mattered was survivability during riots, ambushes, or urban flashpoints, where patrols often found themselves facing volleys of stones, machetes, or gunfire. Yet within that functional design brief, something unusual emerged. The finished machine looked startlingly modern, as though the engineers had sketched tomorrow's vehicle without quite meaning to. It carried the energy of a design drawn at midnight by someone who decided curves were merely optional extras. That accidental futurism would become one of its most defining traits, turning necessity into a shape that caught the eye long before the fighting ever did. Constructing the Overvalwagen required a type of manufacturing that lived somewhere between organized industry and battlefield improvisation. Workshops across Java, particularly those belonging to companies like Brutt, became miniature armoured vehicle factories, cutting steel, reinforcing frames, and adapting truck chassis that had never been designed to carry the weight of armour. These were not luxury facilities stocked with precision equipment. They were practical machine shops that relied on skilled welders, robust lathes, and the kind of mechanical intuition that only comes from years of repairing colonial infrastructure. The process began with selecting a truck chassis strong enough to serve as the spine of the vehicle. Mechanics stripped away the civilian bodywork until only the ladder frame, the engine, and the drivetrain remained. Every kilogram mattered because the added armour risked overwhelming the truck's suspension, so the builders reinforced leaf springs and strengthened mounting points to prevent sagging. It was a delicate balance. Add too much steel and the vehicle would crawl, add too little and it would never survive hostile streets. Armour plates were fashioned from readily available steel sheets, often cut by hand with oxyacetylene torches that left rough, functional edges rather than smooth curves. These flat panels created the vehicle's iconic polygonal aesthetic. Each piece was angled to deflect small arms fire, with the front plates steepened to encourage rounds to skip rather than penetrate. Because the chassis could flex under load, the armour frame had to be carefully braced so vibrations wouldn't tear bolts or distort panels when driving over rough ground. Inside, the vehicle was intentionally sparse. Benches ran along the sides, allowing troops to sit back to back while leaving the centre aisle clear for rapid dismounting. Ventilation slots were cut wherever safe, though crews quickly learned that tropical heat made the interior feel like a rolling furnace. The construction teams added firing slits for close engagements, but these were basic, small rectangular cuts that offered practicality rather than finesse. When finished, each Overvalwagen was a tangible product of local ingenuity, irregular, sharp-edged, slightly industrial, and unmistakably engineered for urgency. One mechanic famously quipped that the only curves on the entire vehicle were the ones accidentally introduced by a misbehaving torch. Whether that was true hardly mattered. The vehicle's squared steel silhouette became its defining signature, a shape born from the realities of limited resources and immediate need. Testing the Overvalwagen was less about formal proving grounds and more about throwing it straight into the environments it was built to survive. Workshops across Java pushed prototypes into crowded streets, narrow alleys, and uneven colonial roads where every bump revealed another weakness that needed reinforcing. During these early trials, the vehicle's angular armour was struck by everything from stones and bricks to rifle shots fired at controlled distances to judge how well the steepened plates could deflect incoming rounds. Crews quickly discovered that visibility was a constant challenge. The firing slits provided protection, but they limited the field of view so sharply that drivers often had to swing the entire vehicle left or right just to check their surroundings. This wasn't a matter of luxury, it was a necessity in environments where threats could appear from rooftops, shaded doorways, or behind market stalls that cluttered the urban landscape. Despite these constraints, drivers reported that the chassis handled the added weight surprisingly well, provided the suspension reinforcements were fitted precisely. On rough surfaces, the Overvalwagen revealed another characteristic. Its weight distribution gave it a solid, grounded feel, but it punished careless steering with a noticeable sideways slide on loose gravel. The tests showed that speed had to be kept moderate when turning sharply, particularly when the vehicle carried a full squad in the rear compartment. Engineers made small adjustments, reinforcing anchor points and adding interior bracing to keep the hull rigid under lateral strain. Another area of scrutiny was heat. The enclosed armour trapped warm air until the interior felt like a boiler room after just a few minutes of driving. Crews operating in tropical climates demanded better airflow, leading to practical additions such as widened vent slots, small roof vents, and more effective side apertures. These solutions didn't deliver comfort, but they reduced the interior temperature enough to keep troops functional during extended patrols. Weapon testing confirmed the vehicle's intended role. It wasn't designed to trade blows with machine gun nests or handle anti-tank threats. It existed to protect men moving through volatile districts where small arms fire and thrown objects were the primary hazards. In this environment, the Overvalwagen proved highly resilient, with test shots visibly flattening or glancing off the angled plates. Even so, the trials revealed one recurring truth. The Overvalwagen performed brilliantly as long as nobody asked it to behave like anything other than a very determined armoured box on wheels. And in the role it was built for, that was more than enough. When the Overvalwagen finally entered regular service, the question wasn't whether it looked imposing. It was whether this angular, improvised machine could survive the unpredictable realities of urban conflict in the East Indies. Its first major deployments proved that the design philosophy had been sound. The steeply angled armour reliably deflected small arms fire, the chassis bore the weight without catastrophic failures, and patrols that once dreaded traversing volatile districts now had a mobile shield to carry them through danger with newfound confidence. The breakthrough came from its psychological impact as much as its engineering. Civilians who might confront lightly protected troops were far less inclined to challenge a squad riding inside a steel-sided wedge that looked as if it had been carved out of a single block of iron. The tall profile and stark outlines conveyed authority, and this visual presence mattered in a region where the balance between control and escalation was razor-thin. The Overvalwagen acted as both a transport and deterrent, giving Dutch units a tool that changed the tone of confrontations before they even began. Operational reports highlighted clear strengths. The vehicle excelled in narrow streets where its armour offered protection against ambushes launched from close quarters. It could push through makeshift barricades without serious damage, and its interior space allowed troops to respond rapidly once doors opened. Maintenance teams appreciated its simplicity. If a plate bent or cracked, it could be removed, hammered flat on a workshop block, and bolted back into place without waiting for specialized equipment or long-distance shipments. Yet, it wasn't flawless. Its high center of gravity limited speed in fast maneuvers, and its flat armor could magnify heat until crews felt roasted long before engagements ended. Engine strain became noticeable on steep inclines, and tires suffered under continuous weight, requiring more frequent replacements than planners initially predicted. And although it resisted small arms fire admirably, anything heavier, particularly sustained machine gun bursts, could still compromise the hull. Still, the overall verdict was positive. Commanders considered the Overvalwagen a success because it fulfilled the exact purpose it had been created for. It protected personnel in situations where soft-skinned vehicles would have been death traps. It was not a battlefield tank, nor was it meant to be one. It was a shield for urban unpredictability, built from the materials and time available. In the end, the vehicle's greatest accomplishment was simple and undeniable. It consistently did more than anyone expected from a machine that looked like it had been welded together by a man racing a deadline with only a box of bolts and pure determination. That reliability, improvised as it seemed, gave troops a measure of security they had lacked for years. The Overvalwagen's impact didn't end with its ability to shield patrols or project authority in crowded streets. Its existence shaped the broader operational landscape of the Netherlands East Indies in subtle but significant ways that were not immediately apparent to military planners. One of the clearest hidden consequences was how the vehicle shifted logistical priorities, forcing colonial forces to develop repair networks, small armour workshops, and supply caches that previously had no place in their infrastructure. The moment armoured vehicles entered routine service, local commanders realized they needed dedicated teams who understood reinforced chassis, steel stress points, and field welding techniques. This created a quiet but important shift in wartime labour. Civilian mechanics, machinists, and metalworkers were recruited or contracted to provide a steady backbone for the Overvalwagen fleet. Their skills, once focused solely on civil construction and commercial vehicles, became a vital component of military readiness, strengthening local technical capacity in ways nobody had anticipated. The rail adaptations that followed, the armoured rail jeeps built for train inspection and security, were a direct offshoot of that expanded infrastructure. Colonial forces faced increasing sabotage along rail lines, a strategic threat that endangered both military movements and vital civilian supplies. The same workshops that produced Overvalwagens suddenly had the capability to create armoured platforms for railway patrols, transforming flat cars and small motorized rail units into steel-protected inspection vehicles. Without the Overvalwagen program, this rapid adaptation would have been far more difficult, if not impossible. There were political consequences too. By fielding an armoured presence that was locally constructed, the colonial administration unintentionally signalled that it could mobilise modern-looking equipment without relying on European shipments. In a region where demonstrations, uprisings, and competing political movements were gathering momentum, this visual message mattered, suggesting a degree of industrial resilience that the Netherlands East Indies had not previously displayed. Yet this impression was only partly true. The Overvalwagen was ingenious, but it also masked deep shortages and vulnerabilities behind its sharp-edged armour. Social reactions varied. Some communities viewed the Overvalwagen with resentment, seeing it as a symbol of tightened control during turbulent years. Others regarded it with a mix of awe and intimidation, noting how its angular form seemed out of step with the tropical surroundings. like a metallic intruder pulled from a future decade. One observer remarked that it looked less like colonial hardware and more like a prototype someone had accidentally left on the wrong continent. Whether that comment was meant as criticism or curiosity hardly mattered. The vehicle's presence reshaped local perceptions of authority, capability, and technological reach. These unintended effects, technical, political, and psychological, became part of the Overvalwagen's legacy, influencing how both colonial and post-colonial forces understood armoured mobility in the region. When the tumult of the 1940s gave way to a reshaped political landscape in Southeast Asia, the Overvalwagen slipped into a new chapter of service, one defined less by colonial control and more by improvisation, adaptation, and the practical needs of a region navigating independence and instability. Vehicles that survived the conflict were repurposed, rebuilt, and in many cases stripped down for their most valuable components, reflecting a world where material scarcity dictated the future of nearly every machine that remained. As new authorities inherited infrastructure left behind by departing powers, surviving Overvalwagens were absorbed into early Indonesian security units. Their armour, while improvised by wartime standards, offered vital protection during the uncertain years of post-war reconstruction. In an era where the line between military necessity and civil security often blurred, these angular veterans became workhorses for convoy escort, facility protection, and patrol duties along roads still marked by conflict. They were not modern by global standards, but they were serviceable in a landscape where reliability mattered more than prestige. The rail-borne descendants, armoured rail jeeps and inspection cars based on Overvalwagen principles, continued even longer. Railways were strategic arteries, easily disrupted and difficult to defend, so these compact steel-plated platforms became essential tools for safeguarding bridges, sidings, and junctions. Their simple construction allowed new authorities to maintain them with limited resources, keeping vital lines open during tense political transitions and sporadic local uprisings. The practicality of the Overvalwagen's design ensured its ideas survived far beyond its chassis. From a technical perspective, the Overvalwagen left a quiet but meaningful influence on regional engineering. The lessons learned, how to reinforce commercial vehicles, how to shape basic armour effectively, and how to sustain armoured fleets without external supply, became part of the early DNA of Indonesian military vehicle design. Local workshops gained experience that later fed into domestic production efforts, helping future generations build equipment tailored to their own operational environments. What stands out most in retrospect is how far ahead the Overvalwagen looked compared to its contemporaries. Its sharp-edged geometry now reads like a preview of an era where military and civilian vehicles would embrace angular, minimalist design language. To modern eyes, it almost appears as though someone in the 1940s accidentally prototyped a future aesthetic before anyone else had thought to try it. The resemblance may be coincidental, but it has secured the vehicle a curious afterlife in popular imagination. Today, only fragments remain, preserved in photos, rebuilt as rail vehicles, or remembered in stories of dusty patrols across crowded colonial streets. Yet its legacy endures in the idea it proved that ingenuity, even under pressed circumstances, can produce machines that outlast their moment and echo across generations. Looking back at the Overvalwagen's journey, it becomes clear that its strange, angular presence was more than an improvisation pushed into service by necessity. It was a quiet illustration of how design, environment, and urgency can collide to create something far outside the expectations of its era. Where other armoured cars of the 1940s carried flowing curves or riveted silhouettes, this machine strode into history as a rolling contradiction. Rough yet calculated, improvised yet intentional, improvised locally yet accidentally futuristic. The vehicle's most enduring quality was its honesty. It never attempted to be a tank, a breakthrough weapon, or a symbol of technological dominance. Instead, it embraced the reality of its origins, carrying men through places where the line between security and unrest shifted by the hour. Its armour was plain steel, its chassis a civilian base adapted for conflict, and its form a direct reflection of the tools available in colonial workshops that balanced limited budgets with immediate demand. From a design perspective, its geometry feels almost prophetic today. Those steep plates and flattened sides, once born from practical constraints, now resemble the minimalist philosophies of 21st century automotive design. In a strange way, it stands at the crossroads between hand-built wartime necessity and the crisp-edged industrial styling that modern manufacturers actively pursue. This ironic alignment across decades highlights how innovation can emerge unintentionally when engineers strip a concept down to its purest functional requirements. Yet the Overvalwagen's deeper resonance lies not in its shape, but in what that shape represented to the men who served around it. It symbolized protection in environments where soft-skinned vehicles offered none, mobility in areas where foot patrols could be overwhelmed, and a measure of stability in regions where political change moved faster than any official plan. Its survival into the post-colonial period reinforces how its value exceeded its materials, because it delivered capability to whoever inherited it, regardless of allegiance or ideology. In the end, the Overvalwagen is a reminder that history often remembers machines not for polish or prestige, but for the problems they solved when options were limited and time was short. It proved that even a boxy armoured carrier made from flat plates and sheer determination could carve out its own unlikely legacy. And in that legacy, one can still see the outline of a machine that looked uncannily like a future nobody in its own time could have imagined.